This is Women Talking Mitzvot, brought to you by Dorachea and the Stella K. Abraham Migdal Oz Women's Beit Midrash as part of their commitment to bringing women's spiritual worlds into halachic discourse. This podcast series has been graciously sponsored by Sigal and Zach in honor of Women's Talmud Torah, Women's Halacha Study, and in merit of Am Yisrael. Today's episode begins to address the question of women's status in the halachic system. We speak about time-caused mitzvot, the male orientation of the halachic system. This is a broad and really complex topic that requires many conversations to even try and exhaust it. Today, as part of a second and final introductory episode to this podcast series, we begin to address it, but we'll certainly circle back to this topic in the future.
Hi, Yosefa.
Hi, Shana.
So we're back for a second episode to talk about women's status in halacha. Definitely a loaded topic. And I'm curious, when you hear that phrase, women's status in halacha, what it conjures up for you.
Well, the question itself kind of exposes the vantage point of halacha, which is that we are not the vantage point, meaning it exposes the fact that the halachic vantage point is from the male side, and that in some way we're somehow outside of it. I'm saying that currently without emotion, without judgment, but meaning when you have to have a class on, women and Judaism, right? There's no class on men and Judaism. Right. It's just halacha class. It's not men and halacha. So I think that itself, kind of already exposes something. It's kind of, we always used to have this joke, I don't know if you had it, about, Chinese food is just called food in China, right? Meaning, but when you take something out of its context, then it has to have some sort of qualifier. And I just want to say, before we go even deeper into this question, is that I'm not sure that all of our listeners necessarily ever thought about this. And I kind of want to say that if somehow this conversation is going to bring up new questions for them, or some sort of little bit of, I like to call them internal earthquakes. So if that comes up, so just stay with us and let's breathe deeply. And this is going to be one conversation. I'm sure we'll touch upon this in many ways throughout many different episodes. So it's not going to be a disclaimer, but just stay with us for the ride.
Definitely hear that. I think when I think about women's status in halacha, the first thing that's important for me is to distinguish between our status or our worth, let's call it, in the eyes of God and the eyes of Hashem, and our obligation in halacha. I don't think they're one and the same. I personally have never doubted the fact that we have equality in terms of our status before God. I think that He thinks that we're worthy. I think in the first parak of Breshit, we read the pasuk of Zachar Nekeva Bara Otam, even that initial description of the creation of man and woman is a description of the creation of them together. And I also know that I'm heavily influenced by Rav Soloveitchik. In one of Rav Soloveitchik's books, Family Redeemed, he has a beautiful article there called Adam and Eve, where he writes, and I want to quote it because I think it is really, really important that we keep this in mind, even as we discuss a topic that's as complex as the one we're discussing today. He writes that there's no doubt that man and woman enjoy an equal status and have the same worth as far as their humanitas is concerned. Both were created in the image of God. Both join the covenantal community at Sinai. Both are committed to our meta-historical destiny. Both crave and search for God. And with both, he engages in a dialogue, meaning Rav Soloveitchik makes it very clear that women and men are both part of the conversation in terms of our place in this world. When it comes, though, to women and their halachic obligations, I think it's easy for women, especially women who do engage with text and who are familiar with some of the sources that we're going to discuss today, to wonder if when it comes to halacha, we are perhaps somehow on a lower level or of lower status than men. And when I was trying to think about why that might be so, and I'm curious if it's for you the same things, but for me, I think there's three primary contributors to that sentiment. Okay, the first one is that we know that Torah was written B'lashon Zachar. right, was written in a male language. And even though we know from living in Israel that Hebrew grammar is gendered and that the masculine form of speaking is supposed to be generic and it's supposed to address everybody. And even though there's poskim like the Magen Avraham and others who specifically, explicitly write that women are included in this language, still, as you said before, it could leave you feeling a little bit like the other when you're reading everything in language that's specifically male. And also we know that the Torah, the halachic system, is not just like the Torah Shebechtav and the Torah Sheba'al Peh that was given at Har Sinai. It's also all of the halachot that are Rabbanan, which means they're halachot that the Rabbanan established for us, and the Rabbanan were men, so they're going to write in language or in a way that is familiar to them and sometimes can make women feel a little bit apart. So I think that's the first thing, and that's something that you alluded to. But there's two other, I think, significant factors, at least for me. One is the fact that women don't count in a minyan. We know that to say Dvarim Sheb'Kedusha, like Kaddish or Baruch or Kedusha or Torah laning or things like that, you need to have a minyan, 10 men. And I think that's a big thing that women today in our modern society feel. They feel that like, okay, like we enjoy a lot of equality in our careers and in our society. And then all of a sudden you step into a shul and, I'll especially feel this Migdaluz on a Shabbat, morning when there's so many women and then they're waiting for that 10th man to show up. So that's definitely a contributing factor. And the last piece, which I think is what we're going to focus more on today, is when it comes to our actually mitzvah observance. Even though the Gemara in Bava Kama on Daf Tet Vav Amid Aleph tells us that there's three major legal categories in which the verse equated a woman to a man, and we're not supposed to think that women are somehow left out of the halachic system or that they're obligated in a different way. We do know that there is a very significant category of mitzvot that the Mishnah in Kedushin tells us in Parak Aleph, Mishnah Zayin, that kol mitzvot aseh shazman grama, all of the mitzvot that are positive time-bound or time-effectuated mitzvot, anashim chayavim, the nashim turot. Men are obligated in, and women are exempt, meaning all the mitzvot that have to do with specific times, which could be holiday-related mitzvot, like sitting in a sukkah or holding a lulav and an etrog, listening to the shofar, counting Surat HaOmer, but it could also be daily mitzvot, like tefillin and tzitzit, which are only things that apply during the day. All of those are things that women are officially, formally exempt from. So I think, when you take all those three together, it definitely leaves women sometimes wondering, what is our status when it comes to our observance of halacha?
So I think if it's okay with us and also everyone listening, I want to put the minyan one on the side. I feel like we're gonna
Totally
have a conversation about that. We're gonna have a conversation about what kind of context of tefillah exists, because there's a lot more out there than minyan, although that gets the main stage today. So I'm kind of going to suspend that piece for right now, because I think that, we want to talk today about the mitzvot aseh shezman grama, these time-caused mitzvot. But before we get deeper into that, I actually just wanted to respond almost back to what you brought from Rav Soloveitchik about zachar v'nekeva barautam, meaning it seems fairly clear that there's an equality before God. And I just want to also say, we're not saying equality meaning same, but meaning that they have a coveted space and a respected position before God, before each other. And there's an idea that I've been thinking about a lot in the past few years, and it's what I saw in Rav Eliezer Berkovitz's. It's actually his last book. I think there's a reason why he waited to write it as his last book. His book about women and Jewish law. That's called Jewish Women in Time and Torah. And he has an idea there where he differentiates between Torah tolerated and Torah taught ideas. And he says, when he's trying to reckon with what he thinks is a jarring experience as a modern person reading, that you have, on one hand, stories about very phenomenal women in Tanakh and leaders and, whether Dvora as a judge, or we have queens, we have women who clearly they're not the majority of what's going on because it's an accurate reflection of what society was then, but without really an overt derogatory kind of approach to women being leaders and fulfilling all kinds of both spiritual and, again, it's not going to be the majority, but it exists. But then when you start digging into, if you try and collect, let's say, many different phrases or ideas that are expressed about women and their personhood throughout, all of our, I would say, like more of like the Talmudic, literature, Gemara and beyond, there are a lot of statements there that are difficult, to the point where I don't even find a purpose so much in saying them. Meaning they're important, especially if they're going to impact a halachic development, and that's an important question, which we'll talk about in a moment. But they're very jarring, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it's some of the more famous or less famous statements about, women and their thought processes, or how women would, prefer to be in a bad marriage rather than none at all. Right. Or we have all these different, they get thrown around, but there's actually many more that actually have many more nuances than the ones that kind of get thrown around.
And it's sometimes actually surprising for women who begin to study texts more in depth and begin to study Gemara, because they're more interested in engaging in those sources, to discover all of a sudden these kinds of statements.
Exactly. And so Rabbi Berkowitz says, wait a minute, this is jarring for all of us. And that's where he comes up with this, right? And this is where he comes up with this idea of Torah tolerated versus Torah taught. And what he sort of sees, he draws this it's a long book, but he draws a trajectory between the Tanakh, which presents, again, an accurate reflection of what was really available to women at that time, but really, yes, women can do all different kinds of things. And then, yes, putting Chazal more in a specific time context and saying that you have all different kind of ideas that are making its way and impacting. And then as time goes on, really slowly, but it's not as slowly as we think, meaning already in the time of the Geonim and already in the Middle Ages, there are many assumptions that existed, let's say, in the Gemara that they no longer work with. Or just one example of so many is that officially a daughter does not inherit her father's, it doesn't inherit from her father if she has brothers. Mm-hmm. That is a law that was systematically ignored already very, very early on, because it simply did not fit with the world.
So what does he mean? I'm not familiar with this volume. What does he mean by Torah tolerated?
So he basically says that you have all these ideas that are somewhat more derogatory about women that infiltrated from the outside world, that sort of make their way into a certain portion or a certain time period of halacha. But over time, the halacha slowly imagine it like kind of like two lanes. Very slowly, it kind of feeds back into a lane that goes back to a zachar v'nekeva bara otam,
which is the Torah taught.
Which is the Torah taught, exactly. And so now this approach opens up many other complexities to it. The concept of contextualizing Chazal and admitting openly that they're influenced by, their times, which to me, I'm not rationally able to learn Gemara and onward without that piece, meaning I can't learn a different way, but I understand that others don't like that approach and it makes it feel too earthly for them. Right. But it does. It makes you unable to run away from that idea that they're going to be impacted. And yes, sometimes the impact are things that we don't like. I'll just say that's not our topic for today, but this question comes up in the Torah. What do you mean the Torah allows slavery? That today the world doesn't allow that. And
there's no escaping this question.
There's no escaping this question of the contextualization and how Torah is
and
impacted by the world.
And also as people with modern sensibilities who, or as people who journey through different stages of history and time periods, who have to think about how to reconcile sometimes Torah values with other values that we appreciate or that have made its way into our system.
Yeah. So I agree with you. It's important to say this is one topic of so many topics that our moral sensibilities are ruffled. Mm-hmm. Now we have this question of, are we going to clearly side with the moral sensibilities of today, or do we think that the Torah has some meaning? There's a question here about how much are we accepting the ruffling? How much do we want to lean into that? But in the particular case of women, Shayna, I don't actually believe that we're looking to go back in time. I also don't think that about slavery, meaning I do have a deep belief that understanding women as fully functional members of society is a perspective that we're going to stay with. And so I do have a belief that halacha is going to is joining on this journey, and it's maybe sometimes works at a different pace as it should maybe than the rest of the world. But I do believe that this is a value that's here to stay. And I believe, like Rav Soloveitchik is writing and like Rav Eliezer Berkovitz, that there is this is, and it has already impacted the way the halachic community functions.
Yeah. And I think it makes it all the more important for us to engage and participate in conversations like the one that we're having now. So like, what does that mean for us? I think the point of this podcast is anyone who's interested in understanding the development of these topics could always go to the articles on Jachaha and to read the sources and the unfolding of these areas of halacha. I think what we, are trying to do is talk about like, how do we feel this in our lives? What does this mean for us in very real ways? Yeah. And I'm wondering, like, when did you start thinking about these ideas? Are these things that bothered you from when you were a little girl, or what explanations were you given?
Okay, so I guess I have to just very briefly fill in like what my background is, because I didn't grow up in a world that was, steeped in learning. And so I had halacha class in my, Jewish day school and high school, but this is not something that like ever hit my radar at all as a young adolescent. You
didn't think about like, how come the boys are in shul on Sunday morning and you're not, or questions like that?
I don't know. Well, I also had one older brother and I barely grew up with him in the same house. No, I never ever thought about, that he had accoutrements of Judaism that I didn't have. It never, ever, ever occurred to me. But I'm saying this truly, Shana, I think it's that as my mitzvah life became more of a central feature and something that was a major part of my identity, that slowly then builds something up. But it was the envelope of my life. It was the structure. But no, I never thought about it. It was just, and I think that probably many people are like that. I don't think that was the part that was unusual. But definitely when I reached a certain age and then spent many years much more, developing my Torah life, identity, knowledge, spiritual life in general, for me, it still didn't happen actually until I had a child. I never reached some sort of feeling of I had reached a limit or the glass ceiling. I didn't have that experience. I existed in environments that were so supportive of women and Torah life. I went to a women's college also. So, and I know
you didn't rub up against this.
I didn't. I never walked into shul and said, "Oh, this is interesting." It never happened for me. Again, I just don't know.
You never came to a women's section that was locked or any of these experiences.
I didn't have any of them. And so, but then when and it wasn't even because that happened. I had a child, and then all of a sudden, a daughter, and many more after that. And I had a daughter, and all of a sudden, like the structure of how my religious life functioned wasn't able to function like that. Between you and I, if I would have had more patience, it eventually comes back to a certain degree. But meaning it was a very clear moment where I said, okay, my life just stopped also in terms of the birth part and the, recovery. And then, but my husband then continues on, and he was, in shul the next day. And there was something in that when our path started to kind of, and again, you could say what happened when you were pregnant. Also didn't think about it.
But like, what's my religious life going to look like now?
Exactly. What's it going to look like? How is it, are we going to be renegotiating? Like, what does this look like? And I would just say that I was functioning in like a fairly, I would say, and we'll talk about this, somewhat like of a male model, meaning limud Torah, which of course doesn't have to stop when you have a child, but like limud Torah and, presence in shul. And I'm not saying that I was going to minyan 3 times a day. Let's not turn me into a bigger tzadikah than I was. But there was something, the thing that stopped me, and I thought for the first time, was actually when my, I would say female biological identity came to full fruition. By the way, I'll just say that my motherhood identity developed so much more after that. And that's something that it's only been a blessing. But there was this halt moment that, yes, it was interesting, but it kind of only happened for me in that moment after that and not before that.
And only then you started thinking about it.
And then I started thinking about it. No, and then things fell apart. And then they started... And then things fell apart, and today I'm in a very integrated place with some spaces of tension, but that took a long time to rebuild. But we'll get there. But I'm curious what your journey looked like.
It's so interesting because even though I'm a rabbi, I'm a rabbi's daughter. But I don't
The
think...
oldest daughter.
Yes, the oldest daughter of 4 daughters. But I actually don't think I was raised so differently. We didn't grow up so far apart in terms of both of us are from Long Island and, not so many years apart. But what I mean by that is that, yes, I'm a rabbi's daughter, and yes, my parents are very engaged in teaching Torah and in talking about these topics, but there wasn't explicit conversation in my home about women's roles versus men's roles. Maybe because we were all girls, so we didn't have some kind of counterpoint. It wasn't that situation where many of my students tell me about, where like the boys are raised to go to shul in America on Sunday morning, or to make Gemara learning a essential part of their lives, or things like that, and they're not. And then from an earlier age, they're kind of wondering, why are there these differences? So I never had that. And actually, like, my parents raised us to, I don't know, just feel very connected to all different kinds of mitzvot, even mitzvot that we were officially p'turot and exempt from. Like, of course, we ate in the sukkah, and of course, we lit our own Hanukkah candles. And of course, we shook the lulav and eshog and went to hear the shofar and all those kinds of things. For me, I'm only actually thinking about it now. Like, I also went to co-ed elementary school. I went to North Shore Hebrew Academy in Great Neck, and like all our classes were co-ed, and we had, side-by-side education, and started learning Gemara in 6th grade, and it was like a non-issue. And the first time that really hit me in the face really was, I went to an all-girls camp in the summer. I think my parents were trying to balance out like the different things I was exposed to, and they sent me to Camp Sternberg, and there I met all different kinds of girls who were like shocked that I learned Gemara, or shocked that I davened mincha, or surprised that like these things that were basic to my religious life, davening and shul, there wasn't a minyan in Camp Sternberg on Shabbos morning. And that was so hard for me. And they're like, we don't even go to shul. So it was like, wait, what is going on here? And I remember it was the days of letter writing, like writing these long letters to my parents in like 6th grade and 7th grade, and my mother and my father writing back these long letters, like justifying our approach and why we do what we do. And that's when I began to really think about these topics. I think I was pretty young. I was 12 or 13 years old. And
20 years. No, stop. 13 years before I ever started to think about them. Shana, one other thing that I just want to add in is that while I didn't have such a, I would say, frum upbringing in the way you're describing, that you also met other, religious women who are raised in a different kind of religious environment than the one that you grew up in, something that I do feel was impactful for me, but I only realized it retroactively, is that I was very much raised in the cultural zeitgeist of America in the 90s and early 2000s, which is, sort of follow your dreams. You could be whoever you want to be. And there's no qualifier there, about gender. It was just, of course, you could do whatever you want to do in life. And I have a lot to say also about the teaching about follow your passion. I think it's it's not a great formulation for many, many people, but that's a different podcast, not for today. But that, I could say, sits so deeply at the root of who I am. So in whatever I delved into, in whatever realm I was in, it was like, clearly I'm going to do it to the maximum, and I'm passionate about it because I'm a passionate personality. So when my religious life became a much more prominent part of my identity, do you know what I mean? Like that kind of funneled into that. And so like when I would come up against those tensions, it was more of a tension of like, well, that's not really true. Meaning you can't really do, everything you would like to do, or you can't really live it to that potential. Again, my concept of what that means and what that potential looks like is things that shifted over time. But that was like an inner Torah. Mm-hmm. It was like an inner truth that like burns. It's your core. It's so deeply in the core, but I can say that it was much more of what I appropriated through the culture than like a specific teaching in my home
and that's the lens then through which you experienced Judaism also.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think a big influence for me in those early years as I was thinking about these things was my mother. Rabbi Lerner, who taught a course called Women in Jewish Law. Everyone used to call it by the nickname of Widgel, in Central for many, many years. And I was privileged to be her student when I was in 12th grade. And she always she started the year.
So funny.
Yeah, we were all her students. It was very special.
Okay.
But she started the year there with an article from Rabbi Saul Berman. It was really a landmark article. It's from the 70s, so it's from a long time ago. Yeah, I also took him in Stern. Yeah. It's an article called "The Status of Women in Halachic Judaism," and there he describes the way that he sees the fact that women maybe aren't obligated in some of these areas. And it was very, very meaningful for me because, I'm going to read again like in his words and then tell you, I guess, what I took from it. But he writes that while not demanding adherence to one particular role, it is nevertheless clear that since for most of our history, our continuation as a people depended upon the voluntary selection by women of the role of wife, mother, homemaker, the law would and did encourage the exercise of that choice. Exemption would be a tool used by the Torah to achieve a particular social goal, namely to assure that no legal obligation would interfere with the selection by Jewish women of a role which was centered almost exclusively in the home. Meaning what Rabbi Berman is writing is that the Torah never mandated this role that woman has to be at home or that a woman has to be a mother, but it did exempt women from different kinds of mitzvot that would interfere with her ability to choose that role. So he concludes this part by saying it's vital to emphasize that even with these exceptions, the wife, mother, homemaker role is not the mandated or exclusively proper role, though it's clearly the preferred and therefore protected role. So in my head, that phrase of like the protected and preferred but not mandated role is really important because it means that the Torah doesn't box us in. It doesn't tell us that, Yosefa, you have to stay at home and you have to raise your children and you can't go out to shul in the morning if you want to and you can't sit in a sukkah. It doesn't say that any of the mitzvot shesha zman grama are asurot for us to do. It doesn't tell us that we're forbidden, but it does tell us that we're pturot, that we're exempt, which is its way of saying, listen, there's a protected role here that maybe in the eyes of God is somewhat preferred, and maybe it has to do with the ways our bodies are built, and we're the ones that maybe bear the children and nurse the children, and it wants to leave that role open for us by telling us, right, you don't have to worry about running out to shul in the morning, or you don't have to worry about how you're going to balance this. And at the same time, it doesn't mandate it. It leaves it open for each woman to kind of figure out where she's going to find herself in that picture.
I also just want to mention one other thing that I think, whenever you have a conversation about time-caused mitzvot, it's important to say, which is that it's a rule with as many exceptions as it is a rule. And so it's kind of dizzying when you actually open up and there's a bunch of key sources on this topic, but we have many mitzvot aseh shazman grama that all women assume that they are fully obligated in, meaning women have, the shofar is the easy example, but we have other mitzvot where...
there's Shabbos. I mean, Shabbos is, like a weekly mitzvah that has a lot of mitzvot aseh that are part of it, Oneg Shabbat, and that women are obligated in, or Pesach, we have to eat matzah, we have to drink dalit kosov.
And there's a conversation about it because they're time caused, but in the end, the conclusion, but that's already the conclusion of the Gemara that we're fully obligated in.
Yeah,
but
so even the category isn't as broad as people may think it is.
It's not very broad at all. You have but in the end, what's significant, Shana, is that a few of the mitzvot at the end that we are left exempt from are very central to how Jewish identity is formed today. So having an exemption and maybe some other negative comments along the way from Talmud Torah, or having an exemption or not being part of minyan, which again is not part of the same conversation.
Right, and Torah also isn't exactly mitzvot shezman grama, but the big things that are very symbolic, like tefillin, for example,
or kriyat shema. Okay, meaning there are multiple examples that they serve as the fundamental basis of Jewish life. And so if women are exempt from them, then it creates a reality where there's quite a gap between the mass of observance and where women stand in it. So, but just to go back to the Rabbi Berman piece.
Yeah, does that speak to you? Or?
So first of all, I think it's a truth, meaning of course there's a world where leaving space for women to fulfill their biological potentials. I think he also, I don't know if it's in that article or somewhere else, but he tries to claim that there's it's kind of clearly some of the mitzvot are sort of more public mitzvot, meaning that we're sort of creating, is it in this article?
Yes.
That we're creating some sort of boundary between mitzvot that sort of push women into the public space versus not. Again, I think that there's what might have been the intent and the reality it creates. Okay, I think that, yes, it does enable women to still be perfectly involved. The halacha does not prohibit women from doing these mitzvot. But in the reality it created is one that there's a very big gap between us. But again, within the world, there was a massive gap between men and women and their roles until not so recently, right? So I think that I identify with what he has to say. I think that it's a truth. As a woman who has 5 children, I know what that looks like. Do you know what I'm saying?
But if I understand you correctly, you're saying that it could lead to like religious laziness. It could lead to somebody taking that exemption and kind of like running with it or using it as an excuse.
I think that we know that to be. Yeah. Okay. Meaning we know that to be that the exemption is that for most normal people doesn't create a space where they want to then volunteer. There's a mindset about being exempted. It's kind of like, okay, I took that off my mind. It's no longer, right? It's the very unique individual who says, well, I don't need to do that, but I have a really strong passion to do it. And then if you have to do it and there's also a lot of naysayers around you, that's an uncomfortable position to be in. Right. So yeah, there's a lot of laziness when it comes to, there's no reason why a woman for so many decades of her life, right? Let's be realistic. There's a particular decade or decade and a half
where these issues aren't.
Where the issues are relevant. But there's a good today, 2 decades, 2.5, 3 decades where women, there's no reason why they are not going to be part of that. And then all the decades afterwards. Right. But we know that what happens is that when we train women from a young age to be part of this exemption mindset, so they utilize it for many years when it has no real purpose. And then also we both know in the stage that we know we're almost in is then getting women back, let's say, into the shul when they don't have to be home anymore. After years of not going. It's very difficult.
It's reminding me of a phrase that was coined originally by Daniel Patrick Moynihan and then picked up in terms of our discussion by Bulgarida Migdal's Rabbi Leah Sarna, who's currently in Philadelphia. Moynihan spoke about the soft bigotry of low expectations. And Leah Sarna said we could apply that to this area of Jewish life, when there's a low expectation, and it could be even appropriate sometimes for when those factors are relevant. But in essence, just the very fact that there is a lower expectation sometimes ends up, leading to a reality where women just aren't going to choose to engage in the same way. And then over time, that has real consequences. I like to think about it. I remember once even hearing this from Rabbanit Melamed, the wife of Rav Eliezer Melamed, who's the author of Pninei Halacha. She came to speak once in Migdaluz, and she spoke about how when she thinks about like that protected role, she thinks about it more in the sense of like the Torah wants someone to be at home when there's children. Yeah. We don't want to neglect them. We want to prioritize them. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the woman. The thing is that once we, have a society where women are not raised to necessarily be engaged in the same way, so then sometimes that's going to be the reality that we live.
Yeah, if I'll just be honest about how my home functions, is that there's a negotiation that happens, right? Meaning morning minyan, I've never pretended to be a daily participant in that. That's Zevi's area, and it's very important to him, and it's a topic that I think all from couples with an expectation that both are participating. That it's a conversation, and it's a conversation.
She's going to get the kids up and out of the house. It's a
conversation we renew all the time, and he makes a massive commitment, goes super early because I'm not great in the morning. So meaning that's a conversation. But there's many other kinds of conversations, especially if you live in a place where bringing your children to shul is either unwelcomed or a massive disruption. For lots of different kinds of special tefillot, let's say Yom Ha'atzmaut or even Purim, there are all different times throughout the year where we juggle it. We figure it out. Maybe we split up, and on Shabbatot, Zevi, anyways, he likes the early minyan. That's his thing. I always go after. So I, for years, have been able to go I've rarely ever had interruptions. Do you know what I'm saying? Meaning, yes, when I'm nursing, maybe I take a baby with me or I go shorter. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
And
but the point is you could opt in if you want to.
I mean, you can opt in if you want to. And there's so many options of what to do if you want to opt in. But yeah, it requires a conversation and figuring it out, with each other.
I think that because of how the two of us were raised, where it was like so just clear, barur to us that like, of course, we are going to be passionate and engaged with whatever we're doing in life, whether it be our career, our motherhood, or our religious observance, that we are people who, kind of see this almost as like a very practical, technical issue in terms of like, how balance in life will work. But I just want to be honest that there is a whole other approach, known as the essentialist approach, which is a very different perspective on these issues that really thinks like, no, it's not just technical, it's not just practical that we want someone to be able to be home. We actually really, really believe that men and women are essentially different. And I think, the name that's often associated with this approach is Rav Hirsch, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch.
Of the moderns. There
of
are
the
those
moderns,
earlier
yes.
who said it.
Other, David Vaham and earlier different approaches, but I think Rav Hirsch in our generation is often spoken about as someone who really felt that the Torah specifically did not impose these mitzvot on women because it really didn't think that it was necessary for them. And he explains that women maybe have greater fervor or greater natural enthusiasm, or they're more spiritual by nature, and therefore they may need less mitzvot in order to keep them aware of their godliness or of their connection to Judaism. You're smiling at me because it's so not the language that the two of us speak. And I'll share. It's funny because I grew up the oldest of 4 girls, but now I have 4 boys and a daughter. So it's just so interesting for me as we're talking to think about, raising sons and with a daughter, and do you have different expectations for them, or do you want to send the message that they're essentially different? But it's making me laugh because I'm thinking about one of my sons when he was in 1st grade. He came home so excited to tell me that he understands why he has to wear a kippah and why girls don't have to. And he was so giddy to tell me it's because, boys they're just wilder and they're more they need a constant reminder in their head, whereas girls don't. And I remember turning to him and being like, do you think that's true? Is that how you experience life? And, we were thinking about some of his female cousins or some of the girls in his class. And it was kind of like a joke, almost where I didn't want to undermine the teacher. And I really understand and I respect people who come at it from that approach. Just never resonated for me, because you see men who are less spiritual and men who are more spiritual. You see women who are less spiritual and women. I can never take one man against one woman and say this is how it is. But there are approaches that really, really believe. Also, there's Kabbalistic approaches, how about the different roles and the different natures of men and women. And there's also people who speak about how maybe it's about enabling women to be able to be there for their husbands because their natural role is to, be able to facilitate and accommodate his needs, which is already different than, a husband and a wife are they're 2 adults. It's already different than wanting to be able to facilitate a woman to be there for her children. But these are real approaches, and there are people who really, this speaks to them and they find meaning in it. And I don't want to knock it, even though we're from a different world.
I also think that what's significant for us to, again, realize is that up until very, very recently, women were not even visibly seen doing all the things that they're doing today. Right. And I think that, Shanna, you and I would agree that the world has gone off a different deep end in terms of the conflation between roles or boundaries.
There's no difference.
There's no difference. And so we're not saying that. But I think what you and I both believe in is let's give everyone a chance to be part of this relationship with God. There's all these amazing tools that we have that Yahadut offers us. And we would like to be able to see which of those tools, we can utilize and find meaningful. I think that again, I just want to be very clear that yes, while I definitely don't identify with the essentialist approach, I understand why they thought that. Like I understand why looking around the world as you saw it, which was so hermetically divided between men and women and their roles were so different. And this is, well before there's even going to be a World War I where women are going to start doing all these different roles that they have to because men were in the home. Like there wasn't a world to look at that you saw those things. So again, I'm contextualizing.
Yes.
Hirsch, there I am again.
There
I am again. But I
can't really escape it.
I think it's really important. And so I think when we see the world today, we do. We see that there are men who are on a more feminine element of the spectrum and women who are on a more, male, are somewhat more male. Again, these are dynamic sort of like internal alchemies that everybody experiences in somewhat different ways. So is the Torah still going to address different populations? Of course it is.
Right. And I think we ourselves sometimes move through different stages of life where different explanations may speak to us more or less depending on what's going on in the context of our personal lives.
Yes.
So there are times where even as a 12-year-old or a 15-year-old or even an 18-year-old, when I first heard that idea from my mother of like the preferred but not mandated role, it on a cognitive level, it made sense to me, but I didn't really appreciate it. And it didn't resonate in a personal way until I was that mother who felt like, oh, thank God I don't need to get up and go to shul right now or figure out how I'm going to eat in the sukkah while I also have to nurse this child and put them to sleep or whatever. I want to eat in the sukkah. Of course, I'm going to make my way there because it's special to me and meaningful for me. And it's also how I grew up. But I don't need to feel the pressure or the guilt if I'm not able to do that.
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm just going to speak honestly about my nature. Like I'm a very boundaried person. So to me, it's clear that if I'm doing this very overt biological act of whether it's going to be the mothering or the nursing, right? Again, we're both taking care of the children, but then I need to do that. That's my job right now. That's very clear. And right. Yeah. And it is what it is. But again, homes function differently. How long women elongate their biological role is also very different, right? So there's
careers, depending on what careers you
these things all impact the way that
if you're single.
Yes.
If you're a woman whose children are out of the house, all of these things have impacts. So I'm curious, as we begin to wrap up, you and I were both part of a panel recently in Migdal Luz about women's issues, and they did a Slichal HaSheila,
which
where,
is, explain to our audience
it's
what
an
that
Israeli
is.
TV show where they'll take a group of people who have something in common and they'll just ask them. Slichal HaSheila is like, oh, sorry, excuse me, but could I just ask you, which is an Israeli way of just, an excuse to be able to ask any direct question that you want. And it was students' opportunity to throw all kinds of questions that they had at us about these topics. And one of them was, do you wish that you could, be a man or you could have the same halachic status? And I don't remember I think I remember one thing that you answered, but I'll ask you now. If someone could wave that magic wand and say, okay, Yosefa, your religious life is so meaningful to you. Do you wish that you could be a man who's fully obligated in all kinds of mitzvot that you don't have?
I mean, my immediate answer is absolutely not. But it's also because my religious life doesn't only hinge on what mitzvot am I obligated in, meaning my identity at this point is so wrapped up in being a mother, parent. I don't sit every day and think about, what are these mitzvot that I'm not obligated in. I will say that, right, I have 4 daughters and a boy. I want to say baby boy, but he's not a baby anymore. And so I can't just deal with these things and myself, feel integrated, and then I move on because I'm constantly having these questions about, how I'm raising them, what are my expectations for them. Totally. The question about shul is a big, big, big question. And mostly my internal work is to become softer about these topics because I'm constantly also coming up against a cultural expectation, which is actually very different than the one that, I can't say I grew up with, but the one that I was taught when I decided to become part of that conversation. And so I think that my answer is definitely not, but I do think what's very important is this idea about the laziness that I really, really my tefillah is that women have meaningful religious lives, and that it's not just, well, I'm going to daven by myself and never go to shul, and that's very meaningful for me. Like, I think becoming a part of the tzibur, being part of the community, is a really significant piece, and you can do that in all different kinds of ways. So I do wish for more than what is the bottom line, ikar hadin in many cases, but I don't know. I have no interest in being something else other than I am. I love what I am. So that's like my instinctual answer. How exactly to qualify it, I think, is probably an even longer conversation.
Yeah. When it was asked, the first thing that I guess I felt very, very strongly is I think there was a stage of my life where maybe those questions of like, does equality mean that we have to be exactly obligated in the same things? And what does this mean about our worth, or how the Torah sees our role, or things like that, were more complex for me or bothered me more. But at this point, it was interesting to me to see that my instinctual reaction was like, I actually really appreciate the idea of a religious life where sometimes you do choose to voluntarily do something. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes in conversations with my boys or my husband, like, that's something that sometimes they wish that they had more of, this idea of being an eno mitzvah ve'osa, that you're not commanded, but you choose to do it anyway.
Yeah,
there's a certain, there's a passion that comes with the desire to opt in. There's, there's an intensity or an excitement that comes from choosing to be part of something that is not closed off to you, but you also are not necessarily, obligated in the same way. And there's something very powerful about that. And I really appreciate that in my life. I appreciate those aspects of it. Or I appreciate that when I speak to a student, let's say, who's on a secular college campus, and on the one hand, she finds a lot of value in going to Minyan, and she really appreciates the Minyan, she appreciates the sense of community, and she appreciates the structure and the framework. But then she says to me, but they daven very fast, and I don't feel like I could have the kavanah, and I could have the intent that I want to when I'm done with them. And then we come to kind of a conclusion where she says, maybe I'll go on Monday and Thursday when there's Torah reading, and other days I'll daven on my own, or I'll, daven, with the sunrise on the patio, or I'll daven in my room, like in a quiet moment. Or she has a little bit more flexibility than the men who take their religious lives very seriously do. And I think there's a beauty in that also, that I think is important for us to appreciate, even though sometimes when you're not, with responsibility also comes privilege. And when you're not responsible in the same way, so then sometimes you don't always have the same privileges. There's
that amazing article that only exists in English by Rabbanit Chana Henkin, where she writes about the concept of eina mitzvah ve'osa. And that it's a concept that's very powerful in our world today, in a world where people want to constantly also express their creativity, men and women, and that she thinks that the model of, what we've done, and creating, she has very powerful opinions about creating rituals for women's rites of passage that don't exist. Women coming back to shul after the first time, for the first time after having a child. And there are, older traditions of tchinot, like these, like tchina prayers in Yiddish. But creating kind of rites of passage for, a young woman beginning to menstruate, or all these different things that the Torah doesn't give tools to mark them. They weren't seen as events that, were necessarily more significant to mark, but that's also the privilege of being able to, you can create your own, meaning to take the concept of eina mitzvah ve'osa and to sort of, exercise your creativity.
There's something very special about that. I also just want to throw in two other things that are on my mind as we wrap up that help me specifically, and they don't have to speak to other people, but they do help me navigate sometimes the frustrations or the moments where it's like, and I do feel myself getting upset. One is that I really try to have humility before thousands of years of tradition. I really think that there's wisdom in the Torah, and sometimes things that in the moment, because of our Western modern sensibilities, feel off to us. Sometimes at a second glance or with deeper thought, you realize that, like, no, but there is something there. There is a gem there, or there is something real there, or there is something true there that I don't want to let go of so quickly. And it takes time because it's not necessarily aligned with the world that we're living in and with the values that we also appreciate from Western society. But I do think humility is something that anchors me and helps me navigate when things are feeling stormier. And the second point is that maybe this is part of humility, but I experience it a little differently. It's my own confusion, I would say, about sometimes it's like I'll feel something very strongly one day, and then the next day I'll feel the opposite. And then I end up confused of like, wait, Shayna, you're not even sure what you want for yourself. Like on the one hand, like you feel like, you want to count for a minyan, or how could it be that, I'm standing here in Peru, and I definitely felt this in our block minyan, like I'm standing here and I'm like part of the tzibur of the minyan, and like, but they're still waiting for someone else to come. And then the very next day I'll be like, actually, no, maybe this is how it should be. And, so I want to be respected, as you said at the beginning, as like, I want to be respected as a serious Jew, as an invested Jew. I want to be given space. I want to be worthy, not just in the eyes of God, but in the eyes of our religious community. Mm-hmm. But in terms of what that means on a practical level, I'm not always sure myself. And then that leaves me back to like, okay, so maybe there is really something very real here that we have to stop and just pause to appreciate.
Yeah, I think that for me also what grounds me are two things. One, I think, is related to what you said, and one is slightly more radical. But the first one is that halachic time should always move slower than modern time. I think many of us are dizzy right now from the way that time shifts. But halachic time, because of change, within society, it hasn't been very long. And while 10 years feels very long for a lot of us, in the scheme of, as you said, thousands of years of tradition, halacha, we want halacha to move slower, meaning most people want their religious life to be anchored. They want it to be traditional. And so, yes, sometimes that is going to be riding on the back of maybe the way women's roles are reflected, or maybe we'll discover in 50 years or 100 years that a lot of this was an experiment that wasn't really going to go anywhere. We don't know, but meaning because we don't know, I think we do want halacha. It will move slower, but it will trend slower than the rest of the world. And I think also that, and this I'm heavily influenced by certain passages. They're considered also somewhat more radical passages in Rav Kook, who did not write this about women. He did not live in a world yet where women's status had changed as much. But I think his idea could be applied to women's issues, which is that if something is discovered to be over time the genuine will of the halachic community, not over time. I'm not saying a glib, if there's a halachic will, there's a halachic way, but if over time there is a trend that is in line with the halachic sensibilities, it will stick. And halacha will shift over time. Now, again, we're already seeing that in regards to smaller things. I'm not right now calling for, okay, tomorrow, Shana, you count for a minyan. That's not what I'm saying right now. I'm saying something very slow, very gradual, but that the halachic world over time, can start to accept it. I'll say it, by the way.
Or that the halacha always kind of left room for that.
Yeah.
So as opposed to like that molded. The halacha shifts, it's more that the community norms or standards of how we read the halacha, interpret the halacha, view the halacha shifts over time.
That for sure is true. He definitely says something more radical about halacha itself shifting. But he talks about an active will of Sanhedrin. It's not something we have right now. But I agree 100% with what you're saying, which is that the community creates space for something that there was space for to begin with. If the community, men and women included, see that this is something that is part of the ratzon, this is part of the will of the community. And so I just think that there needs to be a lot of patience. And I really also strongly believe that the people who we want to make these slow incremental shifts, if it's what we want, if that's revealed as our will over time, are the people inside that are on the inside, that are the committed, right? The ones that are committed. Those are, here I'm echoing many who have said this before me, but I do believe those are the right emissaries for these kinds of shifts. We want people who are committed to the system, who are committed to keeping this upheld, to be the ones who ultimately spearhead some of the shifting that happens. And again, I think time will tell what this looks like. I agree very much. I sound very confident, but I agree with the concept of humility. I don't know. But I also don't want to ever let the not knowing then make me fearful of doing something that's a lovely initiative to be part of religious life. So that's I think that balance that we constantly try try and create.
Absolutely.
Shayna, we just touched upon this idea of sort of women's obligation or women's involvement in halachic life from a whole different, from a host of different angles. And I'm curious if you had to sort of pick one thing, one sentence or one idea that you say, I would love if someone, takes this with them in their pocket today. What would that be?
I think I'm coming back to what I said now towards the end of just because you are exempt doesn't mean that you can't opt in, and actually leaning into that idea in both ways, both leaning into opting in, that opt in, why not? If you're single or if you're married, but this is important to you and it speaks to you or whatever, opt in to more mitzvot observance, even if you are officially exempt from them, but also lean in not just to doing these mitzvot, lean into the idea that it's okay that we're exempt. And that doesn't mean that we're less than. Lean into the fact that you could appreciate that there's some flexibility that comes with the ability to voluntarily choose something that could be something really beautiful in your life.
Two somewhat paradoxical statements, but they fit together, I think, at different moments of life.
I guess so. I didn't think of it that way. I
think for me, the Torah taught and Torah tolerated is something that has stuck with me for a long time. That is something I feel like I carry with me more when it comes to dealing with source material. Mm-hmm. It's not the thing you need to carry with you, I think, necessarily on a daily basis, but anyone who's learning these sources and wants to be candid with themselves. And I think that that's a piece for me that's been very powerful. And again, it has its price tag to it, but I think that the advantage of it or what we gain is very significant. So I think that one is one I want to remember.
Beautiful.
Thanks, Shayna.
Thank you.
See you in the next episode.
Looking forward.
Did this conversation move you or cause you to think about the topic in a new way? Please share these episodes with friends and family and start conversations about meaningful mitzvah observance with all of them. You can contact us with thoughts and questions at womentalkingmitzvot@gmail.com. That's womentalkingmitzvot@gmail.com. Looking forward to our next conversation.